I still remember the first time I heard Maura Murray's name. It wasn't just another missing persons case. It felt colder, darker, the kind of story that presses down on your chest the more you learn about it. I was scrolling through old forums late one night, looking for something to distract me when I saw her photo. A young woman with intense eyes somewhere between hopeful and haunted. Her name kept popping up, and the more I clicked, the deeper I sank. A college student gone without a trace on a lonely New Hampshire road in the dead of winter. No goodbye, no signs of a struggle. Just a crashed car, a vanished girl, and 1,000 questions no one could answer. I remember staring at that first police photo of her Saturn. The snow looked untouched around it, like time had frozen. No footprints, no chaos, just quiet. But it was the silence that screamed the loudest. I couldn't stop asking myself, how does someone just disappear like that? In America, in the age of cameras and cell towers, and yet, Maura did. Or maybe someone made sure she did. Maura was 21 when she vanished. A junior nursing student at UMass Amherst. She ran track. She had been a cadet at West Point before transferring out. Bright, focused, beautiful. But the more I read, the more I saw the cracks beneath that polished surface. Her family said she was driven, never let things slide. But some friends said there was a sadness in her, a kind of weight she carried quietly. And in the weeks before she disappeared, it showed. There was an incident, something people now look back on with fresh eyes. She was working a late shift at her campus security job when she suddenly broke down crying uncontrollably. When asked what was wrong, all she said was, "My sister." But when her sister was contacted later, she was just as confused. Nothing had happened. No fight, no tragedy. It was like Maura had seen a ghost. Around that same time, Maura was caught using a stolen credit card number to order food. Small stuff pizza delivery. But it didn't make sense. She had money in her account. Why risk it? Was it a cry for help? A form of sabotage? Or something darker? And then, quietly, she began preparing to leave. She emailed her professors saying there had been a death in the family. There hadn't. She told no one, not her friends, not her boyfriend, not her roommate. She packed a box of personal items, printed driving directions to Vermont, bought alcohol, withdrew nearly all the money from her account, $280. It's as if she was planning to vanish, or maybe she knew someone else was planning it for her. It started with a breakdown, one that at the time didn't seem like the beginning of anything, but now, looking back, feels like the first crack in something much bigger. It was Thursday, February 5th, 2004. Maura was working her late-night shift at the UMass Amherst security desk, a job she'd done 100 times before. The dorm was quiet. Students were either asleep or out partying. Nothing out of the ordinary, until around 1 in the morning when a supervisor found Maura sitting at her desk, completely frozen. Her face was pale, tears were streaming down, and she wouldn't stop crying. She was barely able to speak, but when pressed, she finally muttered two strange, trembling words, "My sister." No further explanation, no details, just that. The supervisor walked her back to her dorm room, but the next morning, Maura's sister said nothing had happened. No argument, no emotional phone call, no family emergency. Everything was normal, at least on their end. So what triggered her? Was it something personal she couldn't put into words? A memory? A confrontation? Or something she just found out? Whatever it was, it shook her badly. And within just a few days, Maura would be gone. After that emotional collapse, things got even more confusing. Maura stopped talking, stopped sharing, and behind closed doors, she started making moves no one around her could explain. She emailed her professors and supervisors saying there had been a death in the family, that she'd be gone for a week. But that was a lie. There had been no death, no funeral. It was an excuse. The question is, for what? She started to quietly pack up her dorm room, took down wall decorations, placed belongings neatly into boxes. Some she labeled, some she didn't, as if she wasn't sure if she was leaving for a break or forever. She went to an ATM and withdrew most of the money from her account, just under $300. Not a huge amount, but just enough to suggest a short-term plan. She then went to the liquor store and bought alcohol, boxed wine, vodka, Kahlua. Things that looked like they were for one person, not a party. Then she printed out MapQuest directions, not just one route, several. Burlington, Vermont, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, cabins, motels, rural towns, places without clear connections to her, places where she'd be hard to trace. What's more chilling is this. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Not her roommate, not her best friend, not even her boyfriend who'd been planning a visit. She just vanished from their lives. It felt less like a weekend getaway and more like an escape plan. But what was she running from? Or worse, what was she heading towards? February 9th, 2004. It was a Monday. Cold, gray, the kind of day where the sky feels heavy enough to press down on you. Sometime that afternoon, Maura Murray left the UMass Amherst campus in her black Saturn sedan. No note, no goodbye, just a quiet disappearance. She drove east first, then north toward New Hampshire, her trunk packed with alcohol, clothes, textbooks, and a printed itinerary that no one else knew about. Her cell phone records from earlier that day show something strange. She'd called about a rental condo in Bartlett, New Hampshire. It wasn't random. Her family had vacationed there before. Maybe it was a place of comfort, or maybe it was a staging ground, a place where no one would find her. She also stopped at an ATM. Surveillance footage shows her face expressionless, calm, no signs of panic, just a young woman going through the motions. She then bought liquor from a nearby store. The receipt time stamped just before 4 p.m. It would be one of the last confirmed moments we have of her alive. What's haunting is that she had no reservations booked, no confirmed stays, just maps, vague plans, and a full tank of gas. She was driving into a frozen landscape and into the unknown. Sometime around 7:25 p.m. on a rural stretch of Route 112 near Haverhill, New Hampshire, a resident and off-duty bus driver named Butch Atwood noticed something strange. Maura's Saturn was nose first in a snowbank. The front end was crumpled. The airbags had deployed. The windshield was fractured like a spiderweb of impact. But there was no chaos, no ambulance, no panic. He pulled over to check on her. According to his account, Maura was alone, standing outside the car. She didn't appear injured, just calm. Almost too calm, he said later. When he offered to call for help, she insisted it wasn't necessary. I already called AA, she told him. But that was a lie. There's no record of any call. No signal was ever placed from her phone in that area, and AOA had no contact from her. So why lie? The bus driver drove home and phoned police. The time was just after 7:30 p.m. When the first officer arrived roughly 10 minutes later, Maura was gone. The driver saw her. Police showed up. And in the space of minutes, just minutes, Maura Murray disappeared from the face of the earth. No footprints in the snow. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just a wrecked car and an empty road swallowed by night. Minutes after Butch Atwood left the scene, headlights cut through the dark. A Haverhill police cruiser pulled up to the crash site at 7:46 p.m. The officer expected to find a stranded young woman, maybe shaken, maybe cold, but alive. But Maura was gone. The Saturn was still their engine off, front end crumpled into the snowbank. The driver's side door was locked. Inside, it looked like she just stepped away for a moment. There was a small pile of belongings, her school books scattered on the back seat, bottles of alcohol still intact, a stuffed animal resting quietly on the dashboard. Nothing was missing. Nothing was damaged. And then came the detail that changed everything. There were no footprints in the snow leading away from the car. None. The snow had only lightly fallen since the crash. No wind, no flurries, no signs of heavy snow cover that might have hidden tracks. It was as if Maura had vanished into the air. The officer looked down the road, flashlights sweeping across the woods. Just darkness, just silence, just a car, and a void where a person should have been. At first, police treated it like a missing person case, nothing more. Maybe Maura was disoriented. Maybe she'd hit her head. Maybe she panicked and wandered into the woods trying to escape the situation. After all, she'd been in a crash. It was below freezing. Hypothermia could set in quickly. But the deeper they searched, the less sense it made. Search dogs were brought in the next morning, their noses trained to track scent in even the most unforgiving terrain. They caught her trail, faint but present, and followed it for about 100 feet down the road. And then suddenly it ended. No turn into the woods, no change in direction, just a hard stop. As if someone had pulled over, opened a door, and Maura got in. That's when the theory shifted. Maybe she didn't wander off. Maybe she was picked up. The woods were combed by foot. Helicopters scanned the area from above. Nearby homes and barns were searched. Nothing. Not a shred of clothing. No dropped phone. No signs of a struggle. It was as if Maura had been lifted out of reality, right off the edge of that road. And as the hours turned to days, a terrible question started forming. If someone had been waiting for her, who were they? And more importantly, was it someone she trusted? But here's where things get even weirder. And if this next part doesn't give you chills, it should. A few days after Maura vanished, her boyfriend Billy Rausch received a voicemail. He played it back, expecting a clue, a message, something from a friend or relative. But no one spoke. Just silence, and then something else. Something that made his stomach drop. It was the sound of faint sobbing. Not frantic, not panicked, just soft, broken weeping like someone barely holding it together. Billy couldn't tell if it was Maura, but deep down he felt something. And even now, years later, he still can't shake the feeling that it was her. The number it came from, traced, disconnected, a dead end. No name, no address. It led nowhere. It was like the call came from the void itself. Some would later say it was a prank, that people get cruel when cases go viral. But something about the timing, about the tone, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a whisper from someone who couldn't speak freely. Or worse, someone who wasn't supposed to be speaking at all. Her family was devastated, but her father, Fred Murray, wasn't about to wait around. From the very beginning, he believed something sinister had happened. He didn't buy the idea that Maura had simply walked away, and honestly, neither did I. The moment I started reading Fred's interviews, I could feel the desperation in his voice, the frustration, but also the determination. He was a man at war with the terrain, with time, and with the system meant to help him. Fred drove up to Haverhill almost immediately. He retraced her route, questioned locals, stood at the crash site for hours. He combed the woods with volunteers, knocked on doors, demanded answers. He stood in press conferences and begged for the truth. But over and over again, he hit walls. He accused the police of botching the early investigation, said they hadn't treated it like a potential abduction from the beginning. Evidence wasn't preserved properly. Tips weren't followed up quickly, and worse, he believed they didn't want to look deeper. And I'll be honest, the more I read, the more I started to believe him. There were just too many questions, too many inconsistencies, too many moments where you'd expect answers and got nothing but silence. And all the while, Maura was still missing. There was one detail that kept coming up in online threads, in interviews, in Reddit theories that stretch back years, one of the strangest, most debated parts of the entire scene. There was a rag stuffed into the tailpipe of Maura's car, not lying nearby, not half hanging, jammed inside, deliberately. Police noticed it immediately. It raised questions, serious ones. When her father, Fred Murray, was asked about it, he explained it away. He said he'd actually told Maura to do that in the past if her car was smoking. Her Saturn had been leaking oil, and stuffing a rag in the exhaust could reduce visible emissions for a short time. A quick fix, a dad trick, nothing more. But others weren't so sure. Some believed it was sabotage, that maybe someone had tampered with her car before the crash, knowing it would force her to stop. That the breakdown wasn't an accident at all, but the first step in something darker. Then there's the third theory, the one that chills me the most. What if Maura stuffed it in herself that day to stage a breakdown, to create a scene, a distraction, a clean exit? It's a small detail, one dirty rag, but in a case full of voids, even the smallest thing starts to feel like a clue or a warning. In the days and weeks that followed her disappearance, reports began trickling in sightings of a young woman matching Maura's description. One came from a gas station attendant in New Hampshire. She claimed a nervous-looking girl with dark hair and pale skin had come in late at night, bought cigarettes, and didn't say a word. She kept looking over her shoulder. Another tip came from a diner. A waitress said she served a quiet woman who sat alone, barely touched her food, and left cash on the table before slipping out. Her hands were trembling, but each time police followed up, nothing. No surveillance footage, no confirmed identity, no trace. It became a haunting pattern. She was almost seen, almost found, but every time she vanished again, like smoke slipping through fingers. Some said it was wishful thinking. People wanted to see her. Others said it was grief projecting itself onto strangers. But the descriptions were often eerily specific details that didn't make the news. Clothing, mannerisms, scars, her walk. It was like Maura was there, but just out of reach. As if she had stepped off the road that night and into some parallel version of the world, one we can't quite access. One where she might still be alive, or desperately trying to get back. Then came the house, the one that everyone in the online forums whispered about for years. It sat just a short distance from where Maura's Saturn was found, an ordinary-looking home tucked back off Route 112, but it had a basement, and that's where things got strange. Years after Maura's disappearance, a private search team brought in cadaver dogs. The dogs alerted twice in the same corner of that basement. Their training doesn't lie. They respond to the scent of human remains. And the next step was obvious. Bring in ground-penetrating radar. The scan revealed something else. An anomaly beneath the concrete, something buried. But here's the chilling twist. The homeowner refused to allow a dig. Despite the growing media attention, despite the public pressure, no excavation was allowed. For years, that basement became a black hole in the case, a location that might have held the key to everything or nothing at all. And when investigators finally returned after documentaries reignited interest, it was too late. The scent was gone. The scan was inconclusive. The house, still standing, still holding its secrets. It's like the ground itself had whispered a clue, and then closed its mouth. When I couldn't sleep, I started digging into Maura's digital footprint, every search, every note, every fragment of her online life, and the pattern that emerged was unsettling. In the days before she vanished, Maura had searched for directions to remote cabins in Vermont and New Hampshire. Not hotels, not populated places, cabins. The kind of places you could disappear into. No front desk, no cameras, no questions. She also looked up information about alcohol poisoning, as well as hiking trails and weather conditions in the mountains. And then, nothing. No outgoing calls, no texts, no signs of panic or second thoughts, just silence. She had bought alcohol, yes, but not for a group, not even for a weekend getaway. Enough for one, a bottle of Kahlua, a box of wine, some vodka. It wasn't a party, it was preparation. But for what? Was this the outline of a suicide plan? Was she trying to escape something no one else knew about? Or was she meeting someone she'd been in contact with online, someone she trusted or thought she could? It felt less like a breadcrumb trail and more like the blueprint of a vanishing. Her friends described her as quiet, composed, but always a little distant. She wasn't the kind to overshare. Even her closest friends admitted there were things Maura just didn't talk about, things she kept buried, secrets that in hindsight feel enormous. Rumors began to bubble up almost immediately after her disappearance. Was she having an affair? Was she pregnant and hiding it? Was she planning to run away and start over somewhere new? There were fragments to support each theory, but never enough to connect the full picture. She had an army boyfriend stationed far away. Their relationship had ups and downs, emails that read warm one day, cold the next. She'd reportedly had other relationships too, but nothing clearly pointed to motive. Nothing screamed, this is why she ran. And the police, they never named a suspect, never made an arrest, never found a single lead that held up longer than a few weeks. In a case like this, you'd expect a trail, anger, revenge, a note, a clue. But with Maura, it was just absence. An entire life paused in the middle of a snow-covered road, and no one could explain why. There was one theory, though, that refused to die. That Maura was running from something or someone. It's a theory that creeps under your skin the longer you sit with it. That maybe, just maybe, she wasn't planning to vanish, but she had no choice. Some pointed to her boyfriend, Billy. There were whispers, was he too controlling? Did he check up on her constantly? There were no police reports, no confirmed abuse, but something about their communication, short, clipped, full of tension, felt off. Others thought the pressure had just cracked her. Academic stress, a recent run-in with campus police over credit card fraud, family problems, that emotional breakdown at work. It was all piling up. Was she spiraling? But if this was just about stress, why drive 4 hours into the mountains? Why choose a remote highway with no clear destination? Why tell no one? She could have gone home. She could have stayed with friends. She could have asked for help. But she didn't. Instead, she vanished into the dark forest border of New Hampshire. And the scariest possibility, that she knew someone was already out there, waiting. The place where Maura vanished, Woodsville, New Hampshire, isn't just rural. It's the kind of place that feels forgotten, surrounded by dense forests, skeletal trees, and long stretches of highway where you can drive for miles without seeing a soul. I went there once. I wanted to feel the silence for myself. And I did. Too much of it. The houses are scattered, the snow lies thick and undisturbed in the woods, and the wind cuts through like a whisper from another world. The kind of place where a scream wouldn't echo, where help isn't minutes away, but miles. It's beautiful in the daytime, peaceful, But when the sun dips behind the hills, a different mood takes over, something ancient, watching, holding its breath. If something happened to Maura out there, if someone led her off the road and into the trees, there's a real chance she was never meant to be found. And then there's the most haunting theory of all, the one that keeps people up at night, the one her family hates to consider but can never fully rule out. What if Maura made it out? What if she got into a car that night willingly? What if she crossed a border, changed her name, started over? Some believe she was running from something bigger, an abuser, a secret, a life she couldn't live in anymore, that she disappeared by design, that she's still out there. But if that's true, why hasn't she reached out? Not once, not anonymously, not even when her mother was dying of cancer, not even when the world was begging for answers. No sightings, no notes, no digital trace, no movement on her social security. It's one thing to vanish. It's another to stay vanished for 2 decades. If she started over, she did it perfectly, too perfectly. It's been over 20 years, and still the case feels fresh, like it just happened, because the story never got an ending. There's no body, no confirmed sightings, no confession. Just a frozen car on the side of Route 112, and a trail that's gone from cold to frozen solid. Fred Murray, her father, still fights, still returns to the crash site, still knocks on doors. Her siblings still post updates, still beg for tips, still light candles. But time? Time is a cruel investigator. It buries things. It lets people forget. And the forest around Woodsville, it doesn't give up its secrets easily. Maura's story is stuck suspended in that snowstorm, waiting for the final chapter that may never come. So here I am, years later, still staring at that same photograph. Maura in her UMass hoodie, smiling like she had forever in front of her. And I'm left wondering, what really happened to Maura Murray that cold February night? Was she fleeing something, someone, or just broken in a way no one saw coming? Was this a carefully staged vanishing? Or was it a perfect crime carried out in a place that swallows evidence whole? And the final chilling question that still haunts me, is the truth buried beneath the snow? Or still out there, walking among us hidden in plain sight?